When my friend posted about a book I was considering reading, her review was short and simple. And as soon as she said, opposite of James Clear, my curiosity was piqued. Now, I'm talking about the book Unhinged Habits by Jonathan Goodman. And as a fan of the best-selling Atomic Habits by James Clear, I had to know what my friend meant when she said this is the opposite. So today I am discussing ideas from these two books. How do they differ on this idea of transformation and habits? And what are the approaches that they take? Because they are in opposition to each other, even though there are some things they have in common. Now, I will also share about where I fall on this spectrum and where I have gotten it wrong in the past and also seen other people get it wrong. So let's start with the core ideas in these books that oppose each other. Now, Atomic Habits, this one is about making consistent incremental improvements that compound over time. And I've got this picture that I took from James Clear. This is from his website. And it's this idea that making these tiny, consistent incremental improvements compound over time, just like a bank account. Now, what he says here is that over time, even if it's 1% per day, eventually it'll be 37% by the end of, I think it's a year. Now I'm going to read a quote from the book. I've got a little sticky here. And actually two. I've got two quotes. So the first one, improving by 1% isn't particularly notable. Sometimes it isn't even noticeable, but it can be far more meaningful, especially in the long run. The difference a tiny improvement can make over time is astounding. And then he goes on to say, people sometimes make a few small changes, they fail to see a tangible result, and they decide to stop. They think, I've been running every day for months, so why can't I see any change in my body? Once this thinking has taken over, it's easy to let good habits fall by the wayside. But in order to make a meaningful difference, habits need to persist long enough to break through this plateau. And he calls it the plateau of latent potential. Essentially, because this is a curve that starts out really slow, but then it starts to really lift. This is where a lot of people will say, I'm just not seeing these improvements. And so they give up. And I'm sure that many of us are familiar. I know I have experienced that where it just doesn't feel like enough. Now, what is the difference when it comes to unhinged habits and what is this author saying? So I don't have a picture, but I am going to read a couple of quotes. So in Unhinged Habits, there's a particular chapter called Define Your Season. It says, this chapter offers a radical, almost unhinged alternative to the myth of balanced improvement, a seasonal approach where focused intensity on one priority replaces scattered consistency across many. By embracing intense seasons of growth followed by periods of rest or maintenance, you'll make transformative progress in what matters most while keeping the guilt at bay. This isn't about doing more, it's about doing less with greater intensity at the right time. Now, the other quote that I think is important to mention in this context is that he's essentially looking at consistency versus intensity. However, Unhinged Habits still references consistency. And the author says, consistency is undeniably important, but it needs to flank periods of intensity stacked atop one another, focused on one aspect of your life you want to measurably improve. And in the book, just like in Atomic Habits, there's the example of running. Well, I'm running every day, but I'm not seeing anything. In this book, the author, Jonathan, was a personal trainer. And so he does use the example of a transformation for your health. That for many people, taking a period of intensity, say 8 to 12 weeks, really committing to a program and focusing on that, you will see faster improvements than if you, say, started going to the gym twice a week. That's just something maybe you want to do for the rest of your life. But if you just do that, you don't see them quickly. So we talked about that. Now, this idea is that in the gym or with health, when somebody starts to see transformation early, that can actually be extremely motivating. Now, there's one other quote that I think is really important to mention in this book, and I don't think you'll be surprised that it stood out to me. And this is the author being brutally honest, saying, for better or for worse, my human brain craves novelty and excitement and immediate gratification. Maybe I'm not strong willed enough to overcome thousands of years of evolutionary physiology. Maybe my mind is naturally weaker than others. If so, it is what it is. Regardless, it's up to me to work with the physiology that I've got. It's probably no surprise that that is a quote that would stand out to me because I do think how we're wired matters. And even if you are someone, when you read different books by different authors, you can get a pretty good sense that their style is lends itself to the book they're writing. This is how they operate. It works for them, so they write a book and they share with other people how that works. In essence, this is personal. And there's a very good chance you have tried both. I know I have. I've tried the consistency, I've tried the intensity, and I think there is room for both, but there's also a very good chance that you have a preference. And I don't think you should feel judged if one way works better than you or the other. And it's not necessarily an either or. And there might be things in your life for which this intensity followed by consistency might work really well for you. And then there are other areas of your life where actually just straight up consistency is going to work. Now, what I want to do is let's look at some of the pros for both of them. So, an advantage to atomic habits is that you focus on establishing it's a sustainable practice, or as James Clear likes to talk about, it's a system. And that can last over the long haul. So it's sort of this idea of start the way you want to finish. And let's use the example of going to the gym twice a week. So if you can make it twice a week over the long haul, you'll probably be healthier than someone who just shows up to the gym for a few months, then stops for 6 months, etc. So having something that is sustainable over the long haul is great. And because the atomic habits focus on having these systems in place that you can repeat over a long period, it does mean you can focus on multiple habits at one time and sort of build them in a way where they fit into your life, and then you can continue on fitting them into your life. Now, an advantage or a pro to the unhinged approach is that you do see progress faster, which can be very motivating for people. And the emphasis on this transformation through this intense season of your life and then flipping to maintain that can be an effective way to keep up what you've gained. So, with the gym example, if you do gain strength or increase your muscle mass, change your body composition, then later you can go into more of that consistent maintain phase, and it doesn't require the same level of intensity as long as you continue with your good habits. Now, cons. There are some disadvantages. So, atomic habits, we already talked about this idea that sometimes you aren't seeing results and you start to question the effort. Is this worth it? I don't see any payoff. And sometimes with this incremental approach, if you are not going all in, it might feel like you're not really committing or giving it the attention that you think it needs in this moment. And so it also might play with some mindset things around, is this even really a priority? Now, a con for the unhinged habit is that it does, as he said, focus on this and do less of the other things. So you need to deprioritize other practices in your life during that season. And you might start to resent maybe how much time it's taking if you are really, really, really zeroing in on this and this is the season, it's taking up a lot of your time. You might start to hate that you're saying no to other opportunities as a trade off for this period of intensity. The other thing is that you have a high risk of, let's call it a post intensity drop off, which is a mistake that I know very well. And it's a mistake that I've seen a lot of other people make with these periods of intensity. Now, in case you couldn't guess, I am a person who naturally gravitates to go sort of all in. I love a grand plan. I usually like to name my plans. I love this focus, and maybe it's hyperfixation, but in many cases, I do experience a transformation from these seasons of intensity in my life. They can be very fulfilling, and I can get really into it. But, and there is a big but, it can come with this risk, which is the maintain. It's that part where you're staying consistent afterwards, And that is where I am naturally wired to kind of get into the really intense, I like this is novel, this is exciting. But then when it becomes, dare I say, boring or that maintenance phase, it just doesn't thrill me and it's a little bit harder to keep up. I get so focused also on the plan for the intense period that I don't spend any time coming up with an off ramp. And this is something that you need in order to ease yourself back into consistent practices so you don't lose everything that you built towards during that. Now, I'll use a personal example for both me, but also as a practitioner. So, over the years, because of chronic health and autoimmune diseases, I have played around with my diet. I've done a lot of elimination diets, which I have learned so much, a tremendous amount about what works for me and what maybe deters against my health. And during those periods, I was full on. I was all in, full on. But as soon as those periods were over, because I hadn't come up with an off ramp of what does this look like long term? What does this look like sustainably? Everything kind of crumbles and falls apart. And that is where I tend to go wrong. But also, I worked in nutrition. I was a practitioner. I had my own clinic or I was part of a clinic. And when I was seeing clients for nutrition, the same thing would happen to them if we didn't come up with a plan. And the other thing is, if it's something like an elimination diet, which can be used therapeutically of learning what works with your body and what doesn't, pulling out all those foods, as soon as that intense period is done, a lot of people feel like, okay, now I'm just gonna just have all the things I've been missing. So without that off ramp, you can undo or hinder or harm what you have spent all of this time and effort on. Now, I truly believe that either option can work. And really, what they have in common is they both require intention. You need to know what your outcome is. You need to think about what you need to do and what your goals are. What are you actually aiming for? And whether you go with a more consistency approach, the atomic habits style, or a more seasonal intensity and then consistency approach, both cases you can apply the momentum formula. And one of the things I bring this up because it's something I am thinking about in my life right now. After reading this book, it got me reflecting a lot on what has worked, what hasn't worked, and what has the potential for me, but also needs work. And I bring this up because when it comes to creating a plan, whether that's just straight up consistency, going atomic habits, or whether that's going for intensity followed by consistency, in both cases, you need to think practically. So, what is the actual method? What am I doing? What's my system? I know Atomic Habits talks a lot about systems. So, what are the things I need to do in order to improve, whether it's 1% or whether it's intense? But also thinking about how do I make this personal? And that's where mode comes in. How do I have this work for me? And we took that quote, or I read you that quote from Unhinged Habits around this is what works for my brain. And I think that's really important, but not just during the intensity, but also afterwards. What is going to suit me long term? I know that sometimes I struggle with boredom. If it's just a maintaining thing, that can get dry. So, how do I incorporate an off ramp, a plan for maintaining that also includes something that's personally suits me? And also mindset. Mindset is so important. And for this, we can think about what's the perspective I need for whatever it is I'm doing. So if we are taking an incremental approach, what is the perspective so that I stick with this even when I'm not seeing progress right away? How do I handle any doubts that creep up so I don't self sabotage? Now, if you are going for a more intense period, you might have to say, how do I take a perspective or mindset where I don't feel like I'm resenting the other things that I'm letting go of during this period and I'm intentionally choosing this season? And this is something, a choice I'm making instead of taking on a mindset where you feel like you're missing out on all these things that make you want to jump off and say, enough of this. And then for that off ramp, what's the mindset of how do I transition so that I am not self sabotaging on the back end? What's the story I'm telling myself when it comes to maintaining these improvements that I've made? And what does the next season look like? Because you don't want to let go of everything that you've built. And a lot of this is really important mindset work. And if we take that example for nutrition, the number of people who had this kind of all or nothing, I am on the plan, it's intense, or I'm off, and then everything falls apart and crumbles, and then people end up feeling like garbage within a few weeks. So we don't want to swing so wildly. We want to think about that off ramp. Now, for me personally, I am going to be approaching an intentional season of intensity. And I say that with quotes because the experiment for myself is actually around my rehabilitation for some injuries related to hypermobility. I've shared it before, but in the fall, I was diagnosed with HSD, which is hypermobility syndrome disorder. And it is where a deficiency in connective tissue causes a lot of injuries, but it also causes other problems with different organs in my body. And this can make it really difficult. And I've worked with a lot of practitioners, many who are just not very familiar with how to deal with HSD or the other one, Ehlers-Danlos syndrome or EDS. They're very linked. And what I have done is actually registered for a program that is specifically designed for people with HSD and EDS. And I will be going through that program. Now, the thing about the program, and the reason I say intensity, is that these programs are deliberately low and slow because of the chance of injury. Now, I have decided though that there are other sort of habits or practices or hobbies that I enjoy, but I'm going to kind of ease off a little bit on those in order to really dedicate time to making this a priority. Because I know if I can build that foundation and really zero in on that, then I can start to reduce the chance of injury. If I were, say, to take more of the 1% incremental approach, then I just might not be able to get to the place I want to be in the same time period. So I really am motivated by this idea of that transformation, especially if it means that I can start to reduce the chance of injury. And this means saying no to other things and just not feeling guilty about it because I'm intentionally choosing this season. However, there are two plans that are required. One is during this season of intensity. So for me, over the next 2 months, so as I record we're just starting April. It's April and May. And I have told the people close to me that I am doing this so that I can set expectations and I can start to make decisions that say, yes, this is something I'm focusing on. And I can say no to some of the things that might get in the way of that. But I need a second plan, which is my off ramp. And that is really paying attention over the next 2 months. How do I keep this consistently? How do I maintain the progress that I've experienced? And what does this look like on the maintain on the back end, where it's a part of my regular routine, but it's just not as intense? And like the example with fitness, once you have built up a certain level, then it is easier to maintain because you've kind of built up that foundation. And so that's something that I am really looking to do, but I'm going in with this mindset that I need to have a plan and it needs to be personalized to me. And I need to have that good perspective around what does this look like, both during what's my mindset during the intensity, but also what is my mindset after the fact so that I can maintain it. Both require that intentionality. And that is something that I'm looking to do because really, regardless whether you go consistent all the way, atomic habits, or whether you choose something that's more intense seasons followed by those periods of consistency, both of them need intention, but both of them you can have momentum and keep it.